There are really bad zoos and there are better zoos, but there are no good zoos.
Welcome to the Our Hen House interview. I'm Jasmin Singer.
I'm Mariann Sullivan.
And we're so excited because today we're going to be welcoming back Dr. Liz Tyson, who is Born Free USA's Director of Animal Welfare and Advocacy and has worked to protect animals in communities around the world and is the author of Licensing Laws and Animal Welfare, the Legal Protection of Wild Animals, with Palgrave Macmillan Springer Nature. Welcome back to our Hen House, Liz.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Lots to catch up on. It's been a hot minute. But before we do, I just want to remind our listeners and our viewers that our Hen House has multiple podcasts that come out each week, which is something that's, I think, new from when you were last on, Liz. We broke up our very long episode into smaller episodes. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, or even if you do, Rising Anxieties comes out on Tuesdays, the Hen Report on Thursdays, and the long form interview, that's this, on Fridays. Bonus for our Hen House Flock members comes out on Mondays. Don't forget we're on any podcatcher where you like to listen. We're also on YouTube. So hit subscribe and like and comment wherever you listen. Okay. Let's get back to our interview now because there's a lot to cover today. So, Liz, I want to start with the recent death of Happy the elephant at the Bronx Zoo. It has brought the topic of zoos into the news. That rhymed, which is a nice way of starting an interview. Actually, if you could do the rest of the interview in rhyme, that would be okay.
I will.
Cool.
Yeah.
So many of our listeners are probably somewhat familiar with Happy's story, but can you tell us a bit about her?
Sure. So Happy died literally just a few days ago, and she was housed at the Bronx Zoo for almost 50 years. We know that she was captured from her wild home and has been held in captivity since she was a youngster from, I think, 1971. And then she was brought to the Bronx Zoo in 1977. So throughout the years, she did have some company. Of course, an elephant in a zoo is never going to live the life that they should live. But at the very least, these profoundly social animals need to have company of their own kind. And various things happened over that time. And her companion, Grumpy, passed. And since that time, with the exception, I think, of a very short period where they tried to socialize her with another elephant, she's been on her own, or she was on her own until her death. So that's 20 years in essentially solitary confinement in a city center zoo in the US, having been taken from her wild home, which somehow feels crueler than had she been born. Her experience is exactly the same, but there's just that element of, she had the opportunity to have that free living life, and it was just taken from her to turn her into an exhibit for people to gawk at the zoo.
And of course, people know her because she was the focus of the Nonhuman Rights Project lawsuit. Unsuccessful in the courts, but really very successful in a lot of ways in the press that really brought a lot of these issues into focus, but it didn't get her out of the zoo. And the other thing I think she's known for, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't she the first elephant to do the mirror test, the self-recognition mirror test?
To my knowledge, yes. Yeah.
I noticed in the New York Times that it kind of portrayed her as exceptionally intelligent, but that's not true. Like she was extremely intelligent, but so are all elephants, but they happened to do the test first on her that I think they put something on her head, and she she looked in the mirror, and instead of touching the mirror, she touched her own head, which is a way of demonstrating that an animal understands who they are.
Yeah, a sense of self. Yeah, they've used it on many different animals in the past. But yeah, she became famous for that. And it's interesting to see that play out now after her death, because you're seeing the headlines, the elephant who could be a person, and really highlighting that. But like you say, she wasn't exceptional in that sense, because elephants are hugely intelligent. I think one of the things, so obviously the Nonhuman Rights Project brought the case to try and grant her personhood, which is a concept, if your listeners don't know, then A legal person is something different than property, and animals are generally classed as property, which means they don't have the same rights as us. But a person in kind of in normal life, we refer to a person, we often mean a human, but actually a legal person is somebody who has rights, and it can apply to human beings. It can apply to companies. It can apply to inanimate objects, but we haven't yet got to a point where it has been successfully applied to non-human animals. So the case was really interesting. Like you say, it wasn't successful. They didn't manage to get her personhood, with the idea of, if she had those rights, she had a right to freedom, and therefore she had a right to be moved to a more suitable environment. But like you say, we're seeing this come out again. It started a conversation which was incredibly important. And I know the Nonhuman Rights Project didn't do that with the sense of it just being a messaging exercise. There's a genuine desire to get her out there, but it has been a really interesting messaging um, subject, because it was something that really got people to think about that, and what it means for animals to be property, and what it might mean for animals to be classed as persons.
Yeah, exactly. That's really true. And I mean, while they didn't do it just as a messaging effort, they did do it, I think, understanding that they probably weren't going to win right out of the gate.
Right.
And this is part of a long-term effort. And you saw, if you're familiar with the cases, they're fascinating to read how the courts struggled. They did not want to do this because the implications were enormous, but they struggled and said some pretty odd things in the process. So it's like she was the focus of a lot of attention. But there are many animals in zoos, and she was just one of them. And a lot of the activism around zoos involves, of course, the horrors of roadside zoos, which still exist, and and that's a big project also in the legal world. But you've been focusing a lot, if I understand, on these top zoos, quote unquote top zoos. And I imagine that includes the Bronx Zoo, which has really a very, very high reputation among zoos. So can you tell us about that investigation and just the overview of what you found, and then maybe we can go into some details?
Sure. And I think that's I'm really glad you raised the kind of roadside zoo, and what we're looking at is AZA-accredited zoos, because it's kind of interesting. So I come from the UK, and we have zoos are zoos. They're not under different kind of licensing or anything like that. They're not. We do have an accreditation system, but generally speaking, there's not the kind of division between a good zoo and a bad zoo. So here you hear a lot about roadside zoos, and I think everybody can conjure up what that means. You're thinking tiny enclosures, you're thinking inadequate living environments, you're thinking, petting opportunities, commercial operations that don't benefit the animals in any way. And then we have the AZA zoos, that the kind of higher end zoos that talk about, we do this for conservation, we do this for education, these kind of much higher level um, goals and objectives. But from our point of view, yes, there are really bad zoos and there are better zoos, but they're on a spectrum. They're not apples and oranges. They're on a spectrum, and there are really bad zoos and there are better zoos, but there are no good zoos. And the reason that we wanted to do this really ambitious project, we're visiting and investigating 10 of the quote top zoos in the country over a 2-year period, and we're going to be pulling together everything at the end of that. But in the meantime, we're doing these kind of individual investigations and releasing things as we go along. And really our aim with that, or I guess our hypothesis, is that the experience of the animals is not significantly different in an AZA zoo than it is in a roadside zoo, because they're still having few or none of their needs met. They're not able to live in the right climate, in the right social group. They're obviously denied their freedom. They are put under stress because of their living conditions, because of the visitors. And that applies to zoos across the spectrum. So we have already released 3 of our reports. One, the Audubon Zoo, the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, which we just released this week, and as you say, the Bronx Zoo. And I was actually the one who visited the Bronx Zoo. So, like I say, we wanted to highlight that even the best zoos don't serve animals. And we see the same thing over and over again. Zoos claim that their purpose is conservation and education, but we see the vast majority of animals who are housed in zoos are not threatened in the wild. So the idea that keeping them captive is somehow creating this insurance population simply doesn't fly. We see animals like Happy, like Patty, the other solitary elephant, housed in places with these great reputations like the Bronx Zoo. And just over and over again, animals held in inadequate enclosures being subjected to raucous crowds. Um, and yeah, so the Bronx Zoo was one of the most recent ones we did. And we're just seeing this pattern repeated over and over again. There's no zoo that I've walked out of in the 22 years I've been working in kind of animal rights, animal protection, thinking, actually, that one's okay. That one's good for the animals.
Yeah, and just sticking with the Bronx Zoo for a minute, I know that, zoos in particular, the Bronx Zoo, have really tried to recategorize themselves as primarily devoted to the conservation of animals in the wild. Can you expand what's wrong with that picture?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. So the messaging of the zoos is, like you say, it's conservation of species. There's this kind of very vague references to insurance populations, which when you dig down into it, just fall apart. So this idea of we need to breed animals in zoos because they can act as insurance populations to be released into the wild if and when that species goes extinct. What that completely ignores is that the conservation of species in the wild is not simply a lack of animals. It's not like, oops, they're no longer there. We can just drop some new animals in there. Extinction happens because of a multitude of reasons. So it will be politics, it will be habitat degradation, it will be the geographical region, it will be climate change, it will be all of these conflicting and challenging and moving elements that leads to species disruption. And if those conditions don't change, you can drop as many elephants or gorillas or chimpanzees into a free living environment, and the same thing is going to play out over and over again if you don't address the source. So the idea that we can replace animals when a species goes extinct isn't practical, nor has it really happened. There's been, I've referenced this an awful lot. I should be getting commission on it, but there's a great book called, it's in my bookshelf, Ethics on the Ark. And there's a great chapter in that. It was from the late 90s, but interestingly, it still applies, by someone called Benjamin Beck. And he talked about release programs and the impact of them. And there are probably 9 species. So you see the black-footed ferret, you see the American condor, you see the golden line tamarin, and then there's kind of a few other species. And they are rolled out by zoos even today, decades afterwards, saying, these are our success stories. But then when you look into it, and what was interesting about this chapter in this book was that it was looking at the different elements that played into those releases. And for example, the golden line tamarin, if I remember rightly, a lot of the released animals didn't survive. And in fact, it was attributed far more to local education programs that saved that species. And the zoos played this kind of tiny part in it, but yet claim the success. And animals don't get released from zoos. There's probably millions of animals in zoos around the world, and they're not getting released. It's not happening. So, I think the other issue is, as I say, most species in zoos are not threatened in the wild, so that argument doesn't fly for them. And then now, it used to be that a lot of animals were taken from the wild in order to stock zoo exhibits. And that pretty much stopped with the introduction of CITES back in the 60s and 70s. So it now means that these animals who are being bred in zoos are bottlenecking. And there will come a point where, by default, we're going to see inbreeding. It's already happening with some species. And so that means that the kind of pure species that could potentially be released no longer exist, because we're looking at hybrids. So all of that on one side, the claims, I think, are really problematic because they don't really play out in practice. And then the other side to that, I think zoos have rebranded themselves as a result of criticism from animal advocates and people like us. I don't think the general family cares. I don't think they're going to the zoo because they want their children to learn about conservation. I think they're going to the zoo because they want something to do on a Saturday afternoon. And going to the zoo is one of those options for like a family day out. And we are seeing that play out in our investigations.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to get to all of it.
So sorry.
But no, that's okay. That's okay. There's just so many issues floating around here, and so many of them cut to like really deeply to our relationship to animals. So one thing I wanted to talk about, because it's always struck me as so compelling, and it might have had to do with why the tamarins didn't succeed, but I don't know. But that people have this idea that animals just are automatons, and if they're bred and they grow up, they will be the same as the animals in the wild, but they haven't spent their life learning all the things you need to do. It's like if you put me in the wild, I would probably die within a week, and they're probably similar, I would assume. I mean, they have cultures as well as biology, right?
Right, that's right. And there's health things as well. There's the potential for transfer of pathogens, of illnesses, of all of these things. We see this. We run a sanctuary for rescued primates in Texas. And we don't want them to be in our enclosures, even though our enclosures are as big as they can possibly get. We know they're not meant to be in captivity, but we're seeing animals come from these tiny cages in people's homes. And then they need to figure out, hey, don't go mess with that rattlesnake. Don't, figure out, you've got to figure out, what food is good, what you can eat, what you can't eat. And they learn that from one another, which is really interesting to watch. But like you say, they're not, they don't just know this. They don't have the knowledge, but interestingly, they do have particular needs which are hardwired. So the need for, space, the need for others of their own kind, because that's if they lack that, that's when we see the stress behaviors like stereotypies, repetitive behaviors coming in. But like you say, there's the kind of ingrained needs of the animals, which would exist with us. That's the reason that incarcerated people, the incarcerating people, period, but also incarcerating people in solitary confinement is widely considered one of the cruelest things you can do to a human, and not getting into the incarceration of humans, because that's a whole other thing that we probably all have thoughts on. So yeah, there are the general needs, but like you say, they don't learn that. They wouldn't know how to survive in a completely alien environment to them.
I'm really fascinated by the marketing, and I know I appreciate what you just said about how you think people just want something to do on a Saturday afternoon. I totally agree with that. And yet, even now, like as things are changing so much, I think in terms of cultural attitudes about certain types of exploited animals, like fur, animal testing, I still hear regularly, well, but they're doing such a great job taking care of the animals here. Can you talk about like different ways that zoos market themselves and how they're deceptive besides what you've already gotten into?
Sure. Yeah. One of the big things for me is the education side of things. We educate particularly young people. There's a lot of kind of co-opting of like class-based argument. So, in a city in inverted commas, and all of the kind of often classist and racial tropes that come with that phrase. And, we're treating inner city kids who don't get to see animals. And these people can't afford to go on safari to Africa. How else will they learn, compassion for animals if they don't see them in person? And it's like, well, how does my toddler daughter, why is she obsessed with dinosaurs? Like, she can't go and see a dinosaur in person, but my goodness, if she could be a dinosaur, she would be. And really, oh, hi, puppy. Sorry. A dog just came in.
Yeah, no, this is Murray, and he needed to be with me. It was extremely important that he is touching me 100% of the time.
That was super unprofessional for me to interrupt that, but he's gorgeous. So yeah, and zoos are kind of like, well, how do we encourage conservationists, et cetera, but pretty much every young person, or a huge percentage of young people in the Western world, will have been to a zoo at some point in their lives. And yet we haven't seen, just millions of conservationists being born. And and the zoos bringing them into that. We're just not seeing what the zoos are claiming kind of play out. There was a really interesting study a couple of years back, which was interestingly commissioned by the zoo industry, and then the data was kind of flipped in the reporting of it. But essentially, what it looked at was, I think, 3,500 young visitors to London Zoo in the UK, and the learning outcomes, and the paper that was published by the zoo industry was like, look at these opportunities we have. But when you looked at the data, it was something like 60 something percent. So the majority of the kids experienced either neutral learning or negative learning. So they came out with understanding it was incorrect, or they didn't learn anything. And in that as well, there was feedback that the children didn't feel that they had the knowledge to contribute to conservation. So it was just one zoo and it was just one sample, but that doesn't surprise me at all. We've been watching people in zoos, during this investigation. We see school groups come through and they are not learning. They're having the time of their lives. They're having a day out from school, but I wouldn't call it a learning experience. We looked at the Bronx Zoo. They have gorillas there, and the gorilla exhibit was really, really popular. But people were just moving through it, lots of shouting, lots of screaming, lots of laughing, because you could see his butt. But the amount of time, the average amount of time that people spent at the enclosure was 1 minute and 9 seconds. So what are people learning from that? It's not, it's not possible to learn in that window of time. So people just don't actually seem that interested, even when they're at the zoo.
Every once in a while, you hear somebody, a defender of zoos, who's a scientist or whatever, who said that their first exposure to animals was at the zoo. It's such an unscientific way to say it. It's just like maybe that person would have been fascinated by animals no matter where their first encounter was. Like it's just because someone once when all the kids around him, was that really a way to keep animals in prison, a reason to keep animals in prison?
Right.
I probably said this the last time we interviewed you, because I say it every time we talk about zoos, and it's a little provocative, but I heard Jim Mason speak many years ago, and he said, teaching kids about animals by taking them to the zoo is like teaching them about sex by reading them pornography. Like, you learn a lot about sex by reading pornography. Or I shouldn't say reading, I'm living in the past by watching pornography. And you do learn a lot about sex, but you learn all the wrong things. And this reductive, stupid, not useless, but interesting in some ways. But you don't really. Is that how we want to live on this planet? Like, just learning the worst aspects of everything and not any of the heart and soul. And it really struck me, and I think of it every time I think about zoos, because I think there's a lot of truth in it. So I do want to cover, in addition to this, my favorite topic, but I do want to cover the whole story, because I'm not that on top of what's going on in the zoo world. When I first got involved in animal activism, I think I was reading more about what was going on with zoos and canned hunts, and where the zoos got the animals, and how zoos started out in a good zoo and ended up at a roadside zoo. It's this whole business. Is that still going on? Because I know there have been efforts to sort of reform that. And a lot of the issue had to do with, they always want babies because babies bring in the crowds. And they don't need babies because babies, they live 20 years and they're only babies for a year. So is all of that kind of scandalous stuff about sourcing still going on?
I think less so now. There have been stricter measures put in place. So, for example, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which was introduced at the beginning of 2022, that essentially cut off zoos' ability to have cub petting operations for the big cats. They can still have it with kind of smaller cats, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense. But I think a couple of things that was the perfect storm, because of course there was Tiger King and the absolute chaos that was, but that brought the issue like really to the fore, and people understood just the chaos of it, the cruelty of it. And so the Big Cat Public Safety Act, in theory, ended things like cub petting. There are still interactive opportunities with other animals. One of the things we do know is that there's a specific phrase in zoo stud books. So the zoo stud books are essentially the record of births, deaths, moves, all of this between zoos. And in theory, the stud book is supposed to monitor all the animals who are in a breeding program, and it's to help ensure genetic viability and just to know where all the animals are. And there is a specific phrase, lost to follow up, which is entered into those stud books where the animal essentially disappears and they don't know where the animal went. And I can't give you exact figures, but we find in our species research, we found lost to follow up in big cats, we found lost to follow up in primates, we found lost to follow up in giraffes and cheetah. So some animals are, quote, going missing from the stud book, but we don't have information on where they're going or the reasons behind that. But it's common enough that it is a category in the stud book.
Is there a fear that they're ending up in cantons after many transactions that can't really be followed? Yeah,
I don't know. I know there was a great documentary called The Conservation Game, which was largely focused on the Big Cat Public Safety Act, but that did actually follow some of the animals, and found that some of them were ending up in roadside zoos. But yeah, I'm not sure the extent to which that has been curbed now with that legislation, and I really don't know on other species what that might look like.
And I just want to mention, because this is actually, I'm so glad I have you here to ask you this. I saw on Instagram or whatever that Representative Gosar from Arizona is introducing a bill to get rid of the Big Cat Act. Is that true? And should we be worried?
I'm gonna, and this, you may have to fact check me on this. I think that the Gosar bill was to water down the public contact element of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. If it wasn't the Gosar bill, there is a bill out and about at the moment, which is talking about giving particular designated people access to be allowed to pet the cubs. There was also some issues that had been raised about the ability for zoos now to do kind of cross national border trading of animals. But that is the extent of my knowledge. So I don't think we need to be particularly worried about either of those, but we're definitely keeping an eye on them. And like I say, I may be taking Gosar's name in vain because it may not be that particular bill, but there is one out there that is.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think that was what I saw in my vacants.
Right.
So I'm hardly a reliable source here. So yeah, anybody who's really passionate about that, please do a little extra research.
So let's talk about some specific species and tell us who is most disadvantaged by being in a zoo and how limited their lives are.
So we've done a lot of research, particularly on the kind of large-bodied mammals. I'm not sure that any species does particularly well in zoos, and I think we've talked about messaging. And the reason we're looking at large-bodied mammals, so we've done reports on giraffe, on elephants, on big cats, on great apes, and we did one on marine animals, not marine mammals. We looked at fish, which I was very excited about that we could do that because they're so overlooked. But we really focused on the large-bodied mammals and the kind of charismatic megafauna, because those are the animals that people really care about, in theory. People understand when you talk to them about elephants, traversing miles and miles and miles every day in these matrilineal groups and these huge herds, and they have these complex practices. They mourn their dead. They form these great alliances and friendships and families and all of that. So in some ways, we've looked into these species because we know what we're going to find. We know that a concrete, cell essentially cannot provide the needs for elephants or giraffe or great apes. But we see it across all species. So for example, with fish, there's a lot of preconceptions. They have a 3-second memory. Absolutely not true. Research and invasive research on fish have shown that they respond to pain stimulus. It's shown that they can problem solve. It's shown that they can use teamwork to achieve a goal. And what you see in zoos is you will see fish pacing. And when we think about pacing, we think about, the big cats wearing a path in their enclosure, but fish also pace. So you'll see a fish swimming exactly the same route over and over again. And that is a sign of stress, but we don't necessarily recognize it as such because they are so other to us. They are so different. Whereas with great apes, for example, I think we can empathize more. So for us, talking about great apes, talking about, what was her name? And I've forgotten her name. There was a great ape who had a gorilla who had essentially been forced to carry, I think, 17 pregnancies. And most of her children died before they reached adulthood. All of these things that I think we can really connect with and understand. Like, imagine that I think she spent like 12 years of her life pregnant in captivity. And then many of her children died, and the ones who didn't were moved away from her. So, those experiences are something that we can relate to, I hope, as humans. And that helps us understand just what that experience might feel like.
It was really moving. So my understanding is that architecture has a lot to do with this too, because zoos design enclosures to make sure the animals don't leave, but create the illusion that they have some sort of freedom. Is that true?
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. And that's something that has changed. And that's something that I think visitors do care about. People do understand now that an elephant in a tiny cage that elephant is going to be miserable. So in the kind of 60s and 70s, there's actually a really great book on that called, it's right here, A Different Nature, by David Hancock, who used to run a zoo. It might have been Sydney Zoo in the US. So he's a zoo person, but he's written this book which looks at changing architecture in zoos. And so initially it was, just contain the animals. Who cares what it looks like? Who cares what space they have? Then it went into this kind of, let's make interesting architecture, which just kind of looks cool, but doesn't meet needs. And then it moved again in the 60s and 70s as people started to feel uncomfortable about the idea of animals in captivity. It moved to these open spaces that, you see zoos calling them savannas. And they have these bigger spaces that they can traverse. But there's a lot of very clever and really kind of cynical design features. So it looks as if the animals can roam anywhere, but there's a moat which prevents them crossing. And using a lot of glass now, using a lot of quote natural features, which are actually just kind of construct human-made features made to look like a tree, made to look like a rock. And then you have kind of spaces, if you think of a kind of grotto style enclosure now, which will often house a bear or house the big cat. Then you have the backdrop, which is the kind of mountain with the rocks. And then you have the moats that they can't get out, but then you just have a fence. So you're looking at this. It feels like you're closer to them. It feels like they have this expansive space. There's also, again, really cynical kind of landscaping tools that are used. So you'll see kind of lots of plants and greenery, but often they will be inaccessible to the animals. So for example, at the Bronx Zoo, the giraffe enclosure has these really high trees, but when you look closely, the trees are meshed and there are sometimes hot wires around them, so the animals can't actually access them.
They're in such a small enclosure, the foliage would just they'd eat all the foliage, right? Like if they could. So you have to keep it actually away from them, but tempting. That's diabolical.
Exactly. And the other thing that was done was, these kind of expansive enclosures where you could see beyond the enclosure, but the barriers were not obvious. So again, it just gives this idea that the animals have a much more expansive space than they actually do. And that in turn makes visitors feel better because they're not seeing them, in these really tiny spaces. But what's really interesting, and this happens across the board, exceptions to that seem to be the smaller bodied monkeys, birds of prey, and reptiles, amphibians, and fish, because they, for whatever reason, still seem to be kept often in similar housing that they would have been in many years ago. So again, I think it's the Bronx Zoo, or it could be San Francisco. One of them has this really old aviary system, which is just cage after cage after cage after cage, and it hasn't changed in more than a century. I have to check which one it is. I think it might have been San Francisco. And they've got birds of prey in there. Birds of prey who would are the very kind of epitome, the very symbol of freedom. Smaller monkeys who are housed again in these kind of old monkey houses, often without any outside space. And that's when you start seeing like the really kind of honestly offensive landscaping and decoration, where you've got a monkey sitting in front of a painted rainforest backdrop, and they actually have no outdoor space, and it's just it's somebody that there's a mural on the background, and they're just a living element in this kind of diorama.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Do you ever just stop and say, this is so fucked up? I mean, like
every day.
Yeah. I mean, I that wasn't actually a question we had for you, but do you?
There's something, I mean, this a little like there's hope in the fact that the reason they're doing this is because people now care. I mean, like 100 years ago when they built those zoos, people thought that was fine. People don't think it's fine anymore. So their solution is not to stop doing it. It's to deceive people into thinking they're not doing it.
Right. And yeah, I do think this is so effed up all the time. I remember one thing that's really stuck with me. Years ago, I was at Dublin Zoo in Ireland, and there was a woman and her young daughter stood next to me, or a child who was with her. I'm not sure if it was the daughter. And the mum was saying to the child, "Look at the funny monkey. He's swinging." The animal they were looking at was a chimpanzee, which I'm not going to be that person. It's like, yeah, it's an ape, it's a monkey. But the chimp was regurgitating and re-ingesting her food, which is a really serious stereotypy, which is generally seen in great apes who are very stressed in captivity. And she was obsessively swinging backwards and forwards on this hammock. And I'm looking at the same animal as this woman and the child. And the woman was interpreting it as, oh, look at the funny monkey playing, having a great time. And I'm looking at the same animal and thinking, wow, she is so stressed and so unhappy. And it's just not recognized. I think there is hope, definitely, that people feel uncomfortable about zoos now and they don't really agree with them. But I think one of the challenges is that nobody's like super invested in zoos. It's not like, you go vegan because you really care about animals, and there's this, real deep understanding that you need to make a lifestyle change in order to make this contribution, you really understand it. You don't wear fur because it's so cruel. But I think with zoos, people are not there yet where it's seen as like really cruel. And so they're like, I don't really like them, but do you know what? My kid wants to go. So, I'll feel uncomfortable, but I'll just go. And one visit, but when millions of people are doing that one visit, feeling a little bit uncomfortable, they're still funding this continuation of it. So I think it's a challenge because it's hard to get people to care about something that they don't see every day. Like, what harm would it do? Their niece or nephews in town, what harm would it do to go and see the bears at the Bronx Zoo?
Right. I feel that same way. That story that you just told, where you were looking at the exact same thing and seeing it so differently, when little children run into a flock of pigeons who are like eating, and they stamp their feet and try and, oh my God, like what is, and also let's
and
just
their
say,
parents think it's cute.
Exactly. Like, what a perfect teaching opportunity.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
I'm so glad you
one
said
of
that.
my things.
I've complained to like friends of mine about that. We're in a we're in a square and there's loads of pigeons and some kid is just running at them. And I'm like, why is that parent not doing anything? So I'm so glad you said that, because I could not agree more on that.
Oh God. It's just it's starting them so young with this speciesist mentality, and it's so weird because you could start them so young with an anti-speciesist mentality.
Right.
It feels like it would be even easier because we're sort of born with an anti-speciesist mentality, and it's just society that's, putting it on us.
And the kids don't even realize they're being mean.
Right, exactly.
They have to be told that,
Yeah.
like, that birds are real and have feelings.
Yeah.
They don't know. They just think it's, like, I don't know, anything exciting that might happen.
And they they mimic us so much. Like, I'm learning this. I have a 2.5-year-old, and she knows to be gentle with the dogs because mom told her that she needs to be gentle with the dogs. She knows that, like, if she sees a bug, like, but she'll like pull it, like, literally, like, stop herself. She's like, she knows that she doesn't touch it. And if she sees a dog she doesn't know, then she knows that she's not to approach without asking if she can say hi. And that's so easy to teach a child. It's really not that hard. But people choose not to do it, I guess, because they don't see it as an issue.
Well, Mariann, you just said they don't know they're being mean unless someone tells them, and I just feel like that about the adults too, I mean,
well, by the time you're adult, you should have figured it out.
Yeah, you should have, but you should have. All right. Well, speaking of kids, let's stick with that subject for just a second, because a lot of people, when well-meaning people, whenever I get to talk to them about zoos, will be like, well, don't you think that kids need to be around animals in order to appreciate them? And they'll go so far as saying, and maybe even growing up to fight for them like you do.
Right.
And I just want to talk about that, and also sanctuaries and how sanctuaries differ from zoos, and your thoughts about them.
Sure.
I just threw a lot out at you.
That's
So
okay.
just
I can
take whatever
take it.
you want
I
and
can
run
take
with it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think people co-opt the messaging of zoos so easily because, like I said before, how many kids do you know that are obsessed with dinosaurs? How many kids do you know who are obsessed with, like, outer space? It's so easy to learn in different ways, and we do learn in different ways in every other situation. In schools, we teach children using, multimedia formats. And going to the zoo is actually just, a fun day out. It's not really a learning opportunity. So kids can learn through so many mediums. And I think what's really interesting now is that we have access to such, amazing nature documentaries. There are now cropping up these kind of really interesting interactive experiences. I took my daughter when she was 18 months old to this hologram zoo in Austin, near where we live. And she was just blown away because she got to be under the sea and she got to, like, look at the fish and she got to touch the fish because, no one was going to get harmed. And there was this giraffe who, like, put his 3D head down and said hi, and she reached out to touch his nose. It was fantastic. And, we have so much opportunity now and so much interesting technology that even if we're like, well, kids can't learn from books, which doesn't fit with any other educational messages we have in the world. But, there are physical experiences that children can have which don't involve seeing captive animals. You look at these animatronic displays. I recently went to the Natural History Museum when I was home visiting in the UK, again with my daughter, and they've got these moving dinosaurs. And she was just blown away because, she had dinosaurs in front of her. So yeah, I think with children are far more imaginative than we give them credit for. And yeah, you don't have to go and see unhappy animals in captivity in order to develop a love for them.
I just want to I just want to share something, Mariann. You probably forget this because it was such a tiny little thing, but we went to the planetarium with Mariann recently, and in the lobby of the planetarium, there was a fish tank, but there was also, or maybe no, you know what? It was the Children's Museum. We went to the Children's Museum.
Oh yeah, because I was
Without
thinking
children.
back to the planetarium.
No,
and
it
I did
wasn't the
not remember
planetarium.
a
Yeah,
fish tank.
we go on like a little
There's a
adventure
very
once a month
famous children's museum
in
in
Rochester.
Rochester where we live
Yeah.
called the Strong Museum of
Strong.
Play. It's a big deal.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so we went, the only group of adults with no children, but whatever. And there was, like I said, there was a fish tank, but there was also like what you just described, animatronic fish as well, like
Mhm.
both of them in the same room. And I said to Mariann, like, why? Like, you're actually literally looking at the alternative
Right.
to cruelty right
Right.
here, you know?
Right.
And I have no point to that story. I just wanted to share it. Mariann, I think were you about to ask something?
Well, I mean, I think that you kind of asked it, but I don't think Liz actually got to it because it was two completely separate questions together, and that's about sanctuaries. I think that you are very, very affiliated with Born Free Sanctuary, but can you just talk about that sanctuary and sanctuaries in general, how they differ from zoos and why they are okay?
Absolutely. Yes. I get to work. I just have my dream job. I get to work across our advocacy work, and I'm also the director of the sanctuary. So we have a primate sanctuary. We have 208 residents right now, rescued from the pet trade, from laboratories, from zoos, and we offer them a home for life. So sanctuaries they're a difficult thing because everybody who works in the sanctuary world wants us to be able to close our doors. Like, we recognize that monkeys don't belong in enclosures, however big they are, in South Texas, period. Um, but sanctuaries exist to kind of give a better, if not perfect, life to animals who are suffering worse conditions. So would a rhesus macaque, Gambit, who we rescued a few years back, is he better off at the sanctuary, or is he better off staying in that 4x4 cage that he's been in for the past 4 years? I think, no one would argue that the sanctuary isn't better for him. But sanctuaries have as their aim lifelong care. So there's no such thing as surplus animals in sanctuary. We do not allow breeding because it is not our job to perpetuate further captivity. Um, and generally speaking, sanctuaries do not open to the public. The animals are not exhibits. Now, some sanctuaries have limited opening to donors, and as long as it's done ethically, then that can be argued for. But our sanctuary, for example, does not open to the public, so that we can just really focus on caring for the animals. They are our priority. They've come from often very traumatic backgrounds. They have specific members of staff on our team that some of them do not like Lila. I rescued her. I literally went into the house and rescued her from her, 3 foot by 2 foot cage. And my goodness, she hates me. But all joking aside, there are members of our team that they find stressful. So I couldn't imagine subjecting them to crowds of people every day. So sanctuary, I think everyone can recognize it's not the best thing for them, but it is a much, much better thing for them than where they are. And, I'm very proud of our sanctuary. We offer as much space as we physically can. We have one enclosure that's 5 acres. We have 40 monkeys living in there. And then we have kind of progressively smaller enclosures, really based on the social capabilities of the individual monkeys. So a lot of them wouldn't be able to live in, massive groups of, 20, 30 monkeys just because of their past. They find it difficult to associate with others, but we might be able to get them living in a group of 6 or 7. So they'll have, a quarter, a half acre, an acre enclosure where they can, live with their friends. And then we accommodate, of course, those monkeys who, were just potentially too traumatized to really be able to live in social groups at all. Our golden rule is that no one ever lives alone. And so sometimes the best we can do is have guys live in pairs so that at least they've got companionship. We only have one monkey currently who lives on his own, but he's a pretty new arrival, and we're in the process of socializing him with another monkey.
I hope it works.
Yeah. I think it will. I think they're going to be pretty well suited.
It's hard to imagine a monkey living alone. I mean, I know they do all over the place in labs and whatever, but that seems wrong.
It really is. It really is. And when you see them, the best thing for us is when you see them just start ignoring us. So I love Lila, who hates me, because when she first arrived, she was so desperate for attention from us. And now she's just like, I live with my friend Eddie, and you better back off because he's my friend and you're not allowed to look at me or him. So yeah, I think the difference with zoos and sanctuaries ultimately is sanctuaries are built on a very different foundation. We are there purely for the animals with no balancing act between what our visitors might want or need from us.
Do you find that the word sanctuary is getting thrown around a lot in careless ways?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is an issue. There's been an issue forever that there is no legal definition of sanctuary. And I'm not sure that there needs to be, but that's one of the problems, that sanctuary is very poorly defined. So one of the ways in which that's been combated is there's GFAS accreditation, the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, and they accredit kind of legitimate sanctuaries that meet the criteria that I think we on this call would understand to be a sanctuary. So it doesn't stop people referring to their work as rescue or sanctuary or whatever, but if they're not accredited, then that raises questions.
I have an 18-year-old Chihuahua who hates me more than anyone has ever hated me in the history of the millions of people and animals I've known. And I, too, am responsible for rescuing him at age 16. He has, like, I mean, like, literally, every hatred moment he gives me, which is every moment of my life, makes me love him more. I digress, but it made me think of your story. That would piss him off.
He doesn't
so
really
much.
like me either.
Well,
I have
but
to say, when I visit, he's like, "Oh no, not her."
well,
He
it's
has
not
one
the
person he likes. That's
it's
it.
not the vitriol that I get.
No, it's not the same.
No. There have been sanctuaries that have been, like, fundamentally against visitor programs. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually kind of straddle those two worlds. I run the Born Free Primate Sanctuary, but I sit on the board of a primate sanctuary in the UK that does have limited opening. I think a lot of the time the opening is very tied to funding, and that opening will support the funding and the ongoing operation. It's not something that sits hugely comfortably with me, because when I see our monkeys, we would have to make very, very careful choices about who we even allowed people to see. We do the occasional visit, and there are areas of the sanctuary we just don't even take a single visitor to. Our board members come down and they don't meet some of the monkeys because they are so stressed with people being around them. So I very much prefer the completely closed, because it just allows us to honor their recovery and not add in an extra element of stress. But I do also understand why some sanctuaries have partial opening. I would much prefer that all sanctuaries were closed, but
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I
agree with that.
I assume they're really helpful in fundraising, which, that may sound venal, but it definitely isn't. Without the funds,
yeah,
you can't take care of the animals.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I have a kind of huge question for the ending, but it is kind of what it's all about. Can you just kind of tie it together? Because we do want to protect wildlife, and we do want species to survive. Obviously, captivity is not the answer.
No.
So what's the answer?
I think some of the most effective conservation efforts are via community conservation. So all too often the conservation movement has been top down, with essentially white Westerners going to the range states of animals who we're particularly interested in and acting as the scientists, so put that in air quotes, with local people being characterized as the guides or the field assistants or the poachers. And it comes
the problem.
and it comes from, the initial conservation movement from the West comes from empire building and colonialism, and it's still very much that way. I'm digressing slightly, but at the Bronx Zoo, which does do the organization does do meaningful conservation work, but when I went into the kind of room talking about the history and their work in gorilla conservation, the same trope comes up every single time. You see a photograph, there is a white man in the middle. He is a scientist. He is named in the photograph, and behind him, there are 3 or 4 people of color, local people, indigenous people, and they're not even named. There is this power dynamic, which is still perpetuated throughout Western conservation. And in fact, local people inevitably every time are interested in the conservation of their own habitats and the species that they share their environment with. And community conservation, which is led by local people, is the only way that that's going to be successful. And, time and time again, people doing meaningful work, facilitating work with local communities, find that there is buy-in, there is interest, and this idea of the white scientist having to go and educate the people on the ground is just, it's outdated, and honestly, it's racist. So focused in,
And it's
focusing there.
bad science too.
Yeah.
I mean, people who have been living amongst these animals for a long time.
Yeah.
No, I remember hearing a story. I guess it was from some guest, which I don't know who it was.
Some
but
guest.
in India. There are areas where there are like wild tigers still. Like I'm sure it's getting smaller and smaller. And people get killed by tigers. It's not a non-issue, and people are worried about it. But they know so much about tigers that I think Western scientists don't, because they've been figuring this out for 1,000 years to try to avoid getting killed.
Absolutely.
If not for any other reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of, indigenous knowledge or local knowledge being somehow lesser than Western science is just really, really prevalent. And I think, there is definitely a role for Western conservationists to be involved in conservation efforts. Of course there is, but it has to be as facilitation or really meaningful collaboration with local people, because we're not going to get anywhere without that.
Well, I am very grateful for the work you're doing on so many different levels with Born Free USA. And I would love it if you would just tell our audience what you're excited about and how they can stay on top of your efforts.
Of course. I'm always excited about our sanctuary. We just brought in 2 new monkeys last week, Nina and George, and they're settling into just there's always someone coming down the pipeline who we're going to be helping. So we don't know them yet, but that'll be continuing to happen. And I think, we're working on really interesting legislative change, the Captive Primate Safety Act, which kind of follows on the coattails of the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which would ban primates as pets. We're continuing this work on zoos, which I think is really important because, as we've talked about today, it's not something that is necessarily well understood. We've got a lot going on. It's a really, really busy time, but folk can find us and follow us on our website and on all the socials. We're Born Free USA.
Amazing. Dr. Liz Tyson, Born Free USA's Director of Animal Welfare and Advocacy. Definitely come back and keep us posted as things continue to evolve, and they are evolving indeed. I'm hoping that like this is one of those issues that in the near future our society looks back on with horror that we ever normalized it. And I'm cautiously optimistic that can happen. So thank you, and thanks largely to your work. So thank you again for joining us today on our Hen House. And thank you, our listeners and viewers. Don't forget you can Donate and become a flock member at ourhenhouse.org/support. Thanks to Vicki Beechler and Jen Riley for their work in producing this episode and keeping our hen house running. And we'll talk to you next time.